It started with a simple shopping trip. My mom and I were wandering through a flea market on the outskirts of town, browsing through old furniture, vintage clothes, and random trinkets. The air smelled of old paper, rusted metal, and something vaguely sweet, like melted candle wax. Vendors called out to passers-by, eager to make a sale, but nothing really caught my attention. Then, at the very last stall, I saw it. A porcelain doll. It was old, but beautiful. Hand-painted features, delicate curls of golden hair, and a small faded blue dress with tiny embroidered flowers. Its eyes were a striking shade of blue, but something about them felt unnatural, like they were just a little too real. A thin layer of dust covered its face, and the paint on its lips was slightly chipped, but overall, it was in surprisingly good condition for something that looked ancient. I hesitated before picking it up, feeling the cool, smooth porcelain under my fingertips. Something about it made my skin prickle, but I couldn't explain why. The vendor, an older woman with deep wrinkles and a thick accent, smiled when she saw me holding it. "Ah, you have a good eye," she said, her voice warm but oddly knowing. "That one has a history, a collector's piece." I glanced at my mom, who gave me a skeptical look. "Do you really want that thing? It's kind of creepy." Creepy? Maybe, but I felt drawn to it in a way I couldn't explain. "It's only $5, the vendor added, a steal for something so special. I nodded and handed her the money before my mom could protest. She sighed but didn't argue, and just like that, the doll was mine. That night, I placed it on my shelf, nestled between some books and a few other childhood toys. Its painted lips curled slightly, almost like a secret smile. I stared at it for a few moments before shaking my head and turning off the light. I forgot about it as I drifted into sleep. Until I woke up at 2:43 a.m. to the sound of soft crying. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The sound was faint, almost delicate. I held my breath, straining my ears. It was coming from inside my room. I sat up slowly. The sound was unmistakable now. Tiny sobs, muffled and broken, like someone trying not to be heard. I turned on my lamp, the warm glow spilling across the room. My eyes darted to my shelf. The doll was no longer sitting upright. It had fallen forward, its glassy blue eyes staring straight at me. A chill ran down my spine as I reached out with trembling fingers to set it upright again. My breath caught as I noticed something I hadn't before. A tiny wet streak beneath one of its glass eyes, like a single tear. My stomach twisted. I forced myself to shake it off, telling myself it must have been my imagination. Maybe a trick of the light. But when I turned off my lamp and curled back under my blanket, the crying started again. And this time, it was closer. The crying didn't stop. I lay frozen in my bed, my breath shallow, ears straining to hear every sound in the room. The soft, sorrowful whimpers were coming from somewhere near my bookshelf, where the doll had been. But I was too afraid to look. I told myself it was the wind, the pipes, my overactive imagination. Then, just as I gathered the courage to sit up, I heard it. A faint shuffling sound. Something was moving. Slowly, cautiously, I leaned over the side of my bed, my phone's flashlight trembling in my grasp. The beam of light swept over my bedroom floor. The doll sat there, right beside my bed, its head tilted ever so slightly, its tiny glassy eyes locked onto mine. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The air had left my lungs. Then, just as I reached out to grab it, it moved. Not much. Just a tiny shift, as if it had been pushed forward an inch. That was enough. I shot out of bed, grabbing the doll with trembling hands and stuffing it into my closet. I slammed the door shut, pressing my back against it, trying to slow my breathing. I could still feel its eyes on me through the wood. The room was silent again. That night, I didn't sleep. Every small creak of the house made me flinch. The faintest shift of my blanket sent shivers through me, convinced that at any moment I'd hear the sound of porcelain tapping against the wooden floor again. Hours passed, and the night stretched on forever. My mind raced with questions. Was it really moving? Was I losing it? Was there something else, something unseen, controlling it? I checked my phone. 4:17 a.m., the longest night of my life. Then, a noise. Not from the closet, from my nightstand. My breath hitched as I turned my head, moving as slowly as possible, afraid of what I might see. The doll wasn't in the closet anymore. It was sitting on my nightstand. My mind went blank. I couldn't comprehend what was happening, but my instincts screamed at me to run. I forced myself to move, stumbling out of bed and flipping on the overhead light. The doll didn't move. I didn't wait. I grabbed it with both hands, barely aware of my own shaking, and rushed to the kitchen. My only thought was to get it out of my house. I yanked open the back door and hurled the doll into the night, watching as it landed in the grass with a soft thud. I stood there, panting. It didn't move. It just lay there, staring up at me from the darkness. I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my forehead against the cool wood. My entire body was trembling. I had to get rid of the doll, for good. Morning came sluggishly, and I forced myself to go outside, praying that the doll was still lying in the grass. Maybe it would look ridiculous in the daylight, just a harmless old toy. But when I stepped outside, the yard was empty. The doll was gone. I felt sick. I told myself someone must have picked it up. A stray animal, a nosy neighbor, maybe even the wind. The day passed in a haze of paranoia. I searched every corner of the house. Nothing. It was nowhere to be found. The night would come again, and so it did. I woke up in the middle of the night, not to crying, not to whispering, not even to movement, but to a presence. I couldn't explain it. I just knew that I wasn't alone in the room. My skin prickled with the awareness of something unseen watching me from the darkness. I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. I swept the beam across the room. The closet door was still closed. My nightstand was empty. The floor was bare. Then I looked down. The doll was in my bed, lying right beside me. I screamed. I scrambled backward, nearly falling off the mattress. The doll lay motionless, its painted lips frozen in a faint, knowing smile. Its hands, positioned delicately at its sides, looked almost too human. I couldn't take it anymore. My panic-fueled adrenaline took over, and I snatched the doll up, my skin crawling as I ran toward the fireplace. My mind screamed for me to get rid of it. Now, forever, completely. I didn't hesitate. I tossed it into the flames and watched as the fire engulfed it, licking hungrily at its porcelain face, melting away its glassy eyes and painted features. The room filled with the acrid scent of burning fabric and old varnish. And then, just as the flames consumed it, something unexpected happened. The porcelain cracked open, splitting down the middle, and from within, something tumbled out. Hair, real hair, matted and blackened from the heat, curled and twisted as it burned away. A sickening smell filled the room, something far worse than burning plastic or cloth. It smelled organic. I gagged, stumbling back, watching as the last remnants of the doll turned to ash. My mind screamed that it was impossible, but I had seen it, felt it. There was something inside that doll, something that shouldn't have been there. For the first time in a long time, the house felt empty. I barely remember what happened after. I didn't sleep much, too afraid that I'd hear that voice again. But nothing happened. The crying never came back. The doll was gone. Still uneasy, I decided to visit my mother's house for a few days, hoping that distance would help me shake the paranoia that clung to me. When I arrived, everything looked normal. The yard was neat, her car was parked in the driveway, and the curtains were drawn just as they always were. No sign of anything unusual. I let out a slow breath and pulled out the spare key she had given me years ago, fitting it into the lock and stepping inside. Silence. The house was empty, not just physically, but emotionally. The warmth, the familiar sound of the TV humming from the living room, the scent of her favorite candles, none of it was there. It was as if the life had been drained out of the place. "Mom?" I called out, my voice uncertain. No answer. I checked the kitchen, the dining room, the hallway. Everything was exactly where it should have been, perfectly untouched. And yet, a strange unease settled in my gut. Then finally, I reached her bedroom. The door was slightly open. I pushed it wider. I couldn't believe what I saw. There in the center of the room lay my mother. Her body was burned. Not the bed, not the walls, not a single other thing in the room had been touched. Just her.